The hard road to Appomattox. As the war dragged on into 1864, the North's advantages in wealth, manpower, and organization became critical factors. While the Union tightened its blockade in southern ports, the Confederate government, to pay for the faltering war effort, printed millions of dollars in currency unbacked by gold. A shortage of food and clothing and staggering inflation made life desperately hard for most Southerners. By the beginning of 1864, a barrel of flour, which the previous October had cost $70, was selling for $250. With their loved ones struggling to survive, many poor Confederate soldiers deserted, leaving their units to go home to support their families. The South's economic problems were compounded by a government with no strong central authority. The Confederacy was based in part on a belief in the principles of states' rights, but this very principle worked against the need to cooperate in the war effort. In the name of states' rights, the leaders of the 11 Confederate states often defied the orders of the central government in Richmond. The Confederate Congress was ineffective and unruly. Members often attacked each other with guns and knives. Georgia's governor declared, "I am still a rebel, no matter who may be in power." An exasperated Jefferson Davis said, "If the Confederacy falls, it should be written on his tombstone, died of a theory." Davis's own leadership contributed to the weakness of his government. An irritable, self-righteous man, he lacked Lincoln's human touch and his skill in managing people. He battled ceaselessly with the Confederate Congress and constantly replaced his cabinet members. Grant takes charge. Despite their problems, Southern leaders like Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee were determined to fight on. They thought that if war dragged on and losses continued, the North would eventually grow weary and recognize Southern independence. They noted that for all its superior might, the Union had been unable to decisively defeat their Confederacy. Lincoln himself knew that this failure was due in large part to a lack of daring and aggressive leadership at the highest levels of the military. So, in March 1864, he summoned his most effective general, Ulysses S. Grant, from the West and made him general-in-chief of the Union forces. Grant immediately went on the offensive. He led the Army of the Potomac south, intending to crush Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. At the same time, he ordered General William Tecumseh Sherman, his trusted friend and fellow veteran of Shiloh, to invade Georgia from the west and seize Atlanta, the South's second most important manufacturing city. Like Grant, Sherman was a hard-fighting, cigar-smoking officer who wore his uniform casually and disdained both civilian parties and military ceremony. Together, the two generals planned to conquer the South. In Virginia, Lee's outnumbered forces managed to hold off Grant's troops, and a series of bloody engagements ended in a stalemate. When Grant laid siege to Petersburg, a city to the south of Richmond and a major railroad center, his advance halted, and the attack turned into a long siege. Northerners were appalled by the news that 65,000 65 Union soldiers had been killed or wounded in the Virginia campaigns. Even Lincoln's wife commented disgustedly, "Grant is a butcher and not fit to be at the head of an army." The election of 1864, taking sides. As the presidential election of 1864 approached, many Northerners were tired of war, frustrated by the Army's apparent lack of success in Virginia and Georgia, and deeply divided politically. Within his own Republican Party, Lincoln was criticized by those who thought his policies were too harsh toward the South, as well as those who thought them too lenient. As for the Democrats, they were divided between two factions. On one hand, the War Democrats supported most of Lincoln's war policies, though they argued with his larger economic agenda and with his hostile stance toward slavery. On the other hand, the Peace Democrats loudly protested the war and wanted to sign a peace treaty with the Confederacy. Republicans called the Peace Democrats copperheads after a poisonous snake that strikes its prey without warning. At the Democratic Convention in 1864, copperheads won control of their party. They criticized the president as Abe the Widowmaker, stubbornly persisting in needless war. For their presidential candidate, they chose George McClellan, the general whom Lincoln had fired, and who had once dismissed the president as a baboon. McClellan was a war Democrat, but the Democratic Party put forth a peace platform. McClellan publicly asserted that the Union must be preserved before there could be peace, but privately said that if elected, he would call for an immediate armistice. In an armistice, opponents lay down their arms to discuss terms for peace. Prominent war Democrats broke with the Copperheads in their own party and decided to support Lincoln's re-election. Hoping to stitch together a coalition of Republicans and war Democrats, Lincoln ran as the candidate of the National Union Party. In a show of goodwill, he chose Tennessee Senator Andrew Johnson as his vice presidential running mate. A Southerner and a Democrat, Johnson had remained loyal to the Union even when his state succeeded and joined the Confederacy. The choice of Johnson for vice president would have important consequences after the war. Criticized from almost all sides, Lincoln concluded, I am going to be beaten, and unless some great change takes place, badly beaten. On September 1st, 1864, the Great Change happened. Word came in that Sherman's forces had finally captured Atlanta. In northern cities, cannons boomed, 100-gun salutes, and newspaper editorials praised Sherman as the greatest general since Napoleon. A Southern woman wrote despondently in her diary, We are going to be wiped off the earth. Morale soared in the North as victory seemed within reach. Public opinion turned in Lincoln's favor, and he was resoundingly re-elected in November. Notably, Lincoln received more than 3/4 of the military vote. Sherman's March to the Sea. Despite the fall of Atlanta, the Confederacy refused to surrender. In the face of die-hard Southern resistance, Sherman proposed to send his troops on a march from Atlanta to the coastal city of Savannah, destroying everything in their path. He said, We are not only fighting hostile armies, but a hostile people, and must make young and old, rich and poor, feel the hard hand of war. Grant and Lincoln approved Sherman's plan. From mid-November to mid-December 1864, Sherman led his men on a devastating march, leaving a 50-mile-wide path of destruction in their wake. We destroyed all we could not eat, a Union private remembered, and raised hell generally. One Georgian woman recalled, As far as the eye could reach, the lurid flames of burning houses lit up the heavens. For decades after the Civil War, Southerners would remember Sherman's March to the Sea with deep bitterness. Lincoln's second inaugural address. On March 4, 1865, Lincoln delivered his second inaugural address. The tone and substance of the speech was very different from his first inaugural address. 4 years earlier, Lincoln had pledged not to interfere with slavery if the South agreed to stay in the Union. Now he affirmed the widely shared wish for the quick end of the war. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. But he also emphasized his resolve to persist as long as needed to achieve victory in what he had come to see as war against slavery. Invoking passages from the Bible, Lincoln said, If God wills that this war continue, until every drop of blood drawn with a lash shall be paid with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Lincoln was suggesting that the Confederate dead were paying a moral price for the sin of slavery. In 1861, such words would have been unimaginable. Lincoln concluded his second inaugural address with gentler words. He promised that, when the war ended, the South would be welcomed back with a spirit of generosity and brotherhood. As Lincoln so eloquently put it, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. The 13th Amendment. The changing significance of slavery over the course of the war is revealed in the progress from the Emancipation Proclamation, formally issued in January 1863, to an amendment to the Constitution passed by Congress 2 years later. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, he was careful to do two things. First, he listed emancipation only to those states under Confederate authority. By doing this, he retained the loyalty of slaveholding Unionists in the border states of Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware. Second, he did not discuss slavery as a moral issue. Instead, he emphasized his powers as a wartime commander-in-chief to deprive the Southern enemy of an important strategic asset. The Emancipation Proclamation framed slavery as a strategic military and economic advantage for the South. After all, slaves contributed to the South's economy, and their labor helped support the Confederate Army. By 1864, Lincoln and other Republicans believed that it was time to achieve complete emancipation, not only in the Confederacy, but in the border states as well. They were also concerned that the Emancipation Proclamation might not be legally binding in peacetime, when the president could no longer justify emancipation as a necessary strategic measure. In the 1864 presidential election, the Republican Party platform called for a constitutional provision banning slavery. In January 1865, Congress passed the 13th Amendment, which declared that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime thereof the party shall have been, except for except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Reflecting on the change in public opinion, a Republican congressman wrote, "I have felt ever since the vote as if I were in a new country." Surrender at Appomattox. On April 9th, 1865, a civilian named Wilmer McLean was walking on a street of Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, when a Union colonel rode up to him. The officer wanted to know if the army could borrow his house for an important meeting. McLean agreed, but only reluctantly. In 1861, he owned a house near Bull Run, and on the day of the war's first battle, a Union shell crashed into his house. He had moved to the out-of-the-way town of Appomattox to escape the war, and now it seemed to be following him. That afternoon, in McLean's parlor, Robert E. Lee met Ulysses X. Grant. He had come to surrender his army to the Northern commander. Lee's army, though ragged, ill-fed, and drained by desertion, had managed to hold off Grant's troops at Petersburg since the previous summer. But on April 1st, Grant broke Lee's lines and moved on Richmond. When Union troops occupied the Confederate capital 2 days later, the war effectively ended. Lincoln told one of his admirals, "It seems to me I have been dreaming a horrid dream for 4 years, and now the nightmare is gone." Meanwhile, Grant's troops had pursued the remnants of Lee's army to this corner of central Virginia. Finally, Lee, surrounded and outnumbered 4-1, made the decision to surrender, although he said he would rather die 1,000 deaths. Characteristically, the dignified white-haired Lee showed up for the meeting in full dress uniform, wearing a jeweled sword, while Grant appeared dressed in a simple private shirt with muddy boots. At first, the two generals reminisced about their days in the Mexican-American War. Then they turned to the subject of surrender. Grant's terms were generous. All rebel soldiers would be allowed to return home undisturbed. They could keep their horses, officers could keep their sidearms. Grant even promised to feed Lee's starving men. As they parted, the generals saluted each other. Grant recalled feeling sad and depressed at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and so valiantly. As news of the surrender spread, Union artillerymen fired celebratory volleys. Grant ordered them to stop. "The war is over," he said. "The rebels are our countrymen again." Lee, riding back through the ranks of his men, lifted his hat in salute. Some of the men cheered. Others, silently weeping, reached out to gently stroke the sides of the general's horse as it went by. The Andersonville prison camp. Prisoners of war sometimes received cruel, inhumane treatment. In the Confederate military prison camp at Andersonville, Georgia, some 33,000 men were packed under a stockade built for 10,000. One Union prisoner recalled entering the camp. "As we entered the place, a spectacle met our eyes that almost froze our blood with horror and made our hearts fail within us. Before us were forms that had once been active and erect, stalwart men, now nothing but mere walking skeletons, covered with filth and vermin. Many of our men, in the heat and intensity of their feeling, exclaimed with earnest, 'Can this be hell?'" Fed meager rations, deprived of shelter from the elements, Andersonville's northern captives died by the thousands of exposure, disease, and malnutrition. After the war, the commander of the prison camp was tried for war crimes. He was found guilty and executed.